Alrighty, happy Thursday, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have two really awesome panelists today, and we cannot wait to get this show on the road and ask them a couple of questions. But first, my name is Andrew Whipp, and I'm the lead creative and editor at Greenbuzz Agency. And I'm also joined by my friend and colleague for the second time, Amelia Oliver, marketing strategist at Greenbuzz Agency. Amelia, how are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for that intro, Andrew. I've seen a sneak peek of today's presentation and it's packed with so much strategy, so I can't wait for everyone here to see it.
Ditto. As a quick aside, if any of our audience members ended up here and don't know who we are or what we do, shameless plug, Greenbuzz Agency is a full-service video production company based out of Old Town Alexandria. We specialize in documentary, motion graphics, and branded content. So if you or your teams are curious about the process of making a video or looking to tell your own story, then please don't hesitate to reach out. Bringing it back around, today's webinar is the 12th in our Greenbuzz Agency webinar series, which was created to connect our community with thought leaders who can help us break down top-line strategy and best practices and advice during this pandemic. And if you'd like to check out any of our previous episodes, visit greenbuzzagency.com/blogs. There you'll be able to see the on-demand recordings of all our episodes, which include strategies from executives at Twitter and Quibi, PBS, Sotheby's, Make-A-Wish, NASCAR, and a lot more. So, wow, it's actually dawning on me. We've talked to a lot of people thus far. But today we'll be focusing on fostering community and transparency to build brand loyalty. So if you're looking to stay on top of trends in brand marketing and bring some new ideas back to your teams, then you are absolutely in the right place. But before we begin, I just want to make sure that our audience knows what to expect from today's webinar and that everyone's familiar with the features on the platform. So firstly, our webinar will be an hour long, and in that hour, you'll hear from our panelists who will present for about 30 minutes. And then afterwards, we'll have plenty of time for live Q&A where we'll take audience questions. So if at any point you have a question for our speakers, there is a nice little Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen that you can use to send in those questions. And we do hope that you guys follow through with that. And we'll also do our best to get through the questions at the end of the presentation. It's also not too late to invite any of your colleagues, friends, family, neighbors, whoever to join the presentation. Just send them the link from the reminder email that you should have gotten earlier today, and we'll send a copy out of the presentation and recording to everyone afterwards who registered. Time for the panelists' introductions. Today we are joined by Allison Walsh and Nori Lee. Allison is a communications consultant and former head of global PR and digital media at Stoli Group, and was a PR Week 40 Under 40 honoree in 2019. Under Allison's leadership, Stoli's Instagram following doubled in just 2 years. She's been behind the successful launch of two new brands at Stoli, Cenote Tequila and Cebusca, a mezcal inspired by the women of the Mexican Revolution. Very cool. And Nori is the digital marketing senior manager at Sodexo. She is responsible for elevating Sodexo's brand presence, one of the world's largest multinational corporations. A Marketo certified expert with years of industry experience, Nori leads an international team of digital strategists to execute Sodexo's business development strategy across North America. Thank you both for swinging by today. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. So with all that out of the way, I think we are ready to jump in. Allison, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, guys. It's so great to be here. You know, there's always the character count debate. So I do just want to build on Stoli's been crazy busy the past 5 years since I've been there and gone. And actually, we launched 16 brands. Well, we got to 16 brands. We launched 11 in the last 4 years, but I listed my two favorites. We went from being a vodka company based on our name and our namesake to being a dynamic spirits portfolio that includes bourbon, wines from multiple regions, mezcal, tequila, partnership brands like Villa One Tequila with John Barbados and Nick Jonas, and so many more that I might end up peppering in throughout the conversation. But where I really wanted to start, if we can pop up the next bit here, is ingredients. And what I find interesting is that we've been sort of planning for this, and I don't know if Nori will have a similar experience on her end of this, but we've been planning for ingredients mattering more for probably the past 7 or 8 years, truthfully, and even more so about 4 years ago. And what we learned is that consumers today, people I would probably pin right now as somewhere between 28 and right around 40, care more about what's in their bottle. Previous, in spirits at least, we could get away with marketing, and if it was a concert, if it was, for example, a Nick Jonas tequila or Ciroc with Diddy, or there was some crazy fun marketing, or it was, Grey Goose or the look of the bottle, that would get you through, and certainly would in vodka. I think in other spirits like Scotch and bourbon, the taste comes up a lot more, but in something like vodka, it became a sort of empty industry, spirit, I should say, because it is known as an odorless, tasteless spirit to some experts. However, right around 6 years ago, it really started to pivot, and we noticed that consumers are interested in what's in the bottle, and it was a competitor. We're not supposed to list competitors, right? That's a PR 101. But I will tell you, it's just a small guy, 4 letters, out of Texas. I mean, I won't list him, but we found that they were getting renowned for the look of their bottle and it looking no frills and all that, but also for being gluten-free and being a corn-based vodka. And they sort of took it all by storm. And when we did some research, we found that, okay, this is mattering to people. Thinking that Tito's is gluten-free is mattering. The truth of the matter is gluten and certain ingredients get removed when you distill them through the process. But that led to a learning that we needed for consumer confidence to have a gluten-free vodka offering. And we did. We created a Stoli gluten-free. Similarly, we created a ginger beer to take on the Moscow Mule trend. People were interested in specific what was going into these products. And more over the past, I'd say 5 or 6 years, we were getting asked, well, what's in it? What across the board? What makes up your cenote tequila that was mentioned at the top of the call? And people were very interested to learn that it's made of volcano water that comes from Tequila Hill. And all these little questions that previously weren't really asked. Like I said, might have been asked about whiskey. That's about it. We're getting asked across the board through all of the spirits. I think that's also becoming true with food and beverage across the board. I remember back in 2000, I think it was 12, 13, I was working on Subway Restaurants account, and we had a crisis about our bread. And it was that an ingredient from yoga mats was also in the bread of Subway restaurants. However, it was also in every bread. It was in Panera and McDonald's and Wendy's, every restaurant. So that people were just starting to take note of these things. Now, how I pivot that to now is now we're dealing a little bit different with what ingredients mean. And I think now ingredients mean what is going on inside your house. And now it doesn't mean necessarily your physical house or your physical office. It means what's going on behind the scenes. What are your ingredients to success? What are you finding that differentiates your company in addition to what might differentiate your product? So it's an interesting time, and we're all kind of at this same level playing field for the most part when it comes to COVID. I'm going to try really hard not to let people get COVID bingo by listing all of the adjectives that are used to describe these times. More and more, we're finding, I think, that ingredients is transitioning from ingredients in a product and in a bottle to why do I want to work for your company? Why do I want to patronize your company? And I think that goes across pretty much all categories. So we've kind of started to be prepared for it from a consumer confidence standpoint, but it's become even more important now in a bigger, broader way. I think we could go to the next one. So the living room. So I thought you were all going to see my living room today, but lucky for you or lucky for me, you're not, because it could use a cleaning, we'll just say. But I do believe that some of the routines that we're getting into now are going to be with us long term. I speak with friends in different industries quite often and have heard some people are planning for the rest of their career now to be remote. I think we're all just expecting things to change, some for the long term, some for the short. But when I think we've all become a little more understanding, I guess I would say as well. I've been on a few calls where it's dogs barking and kids crying and someone coming in and someone walking out, and we all understand that, and we all can empathize with each other and understand that, yes, I'm on this call, and yes, I have another call with you later, but I also have to figure out how to teach my 8-year-old long division or what have you. And I think whether you're the CEO of an accounting firm, or you're a political analyst and you're on, this week during the RNC giving feedback and we're seeing whatever's going on behind you, or you're an entertainer doing a concert via Zoom. We're getting to know you more and more. And I think it's something to take advantage of, truthfully. I think it's a time to show personality. I was consulting with a new chief executive last week, and more we went along, the more he was able to reveal and unveil about himself. But early on, it was in a dark room. It was very different, and his words resounded, but I thought we could have taken advantage of some of his personal story a bit more. And we started to do that more and more as he got more comfortable and he became more relatable. If there's any sports fans out there, I love talking about the NFL draft in April, which usually the NFL draft, we're all looking at guys' suits, and we are talking about their 40 times, and there used to be at Radio City in New York, and now they've traveled to different NFL markets. But now I had some hilarious debates about NFL draft picks living rooms, and why are they with so many people? And it's COVID, and do they not take it seriously? So we've all gone from being judged sheerly on, and for better or for worse, sheerly on talent or work or what have you, to everything around us. And I think it's something to be aware of, and it's something we can work to our benefit, and it's something that could ding you. But I think it could be used more as a benefit than as a curse. And a couple guys, so admittedly, I don't know if this will get me applause or criticism. I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan, and my guy was drafted, and I was sort of like, oh no, like, look at this guy's living room. It's like 70s living room. What's happening here? And my brother's like, yeah, but that's going to make him he must have a hard work ethic. Like, he's like, that they're not worried about the living room. They're worried about getting to work. So it's just funny times. And I think everything is out there for us, and there's stories to be told. And similar to the draft room or the living room in a draft or during a Zoom call or anything else, these stories can fuel a content calendar. I think this is such a unique time. Internal comms and external comms have been fairly separate entities for the most part, other than putting up your spokesperson or your CEO to talk about things. They've been fairly separate for most industries, and certainly in mine of the longest term in spirits. We're putting out CEOs when there's news to tell, when there's products to launch. But now, again, if there's a story within that you have, or that's within your organization, that you learn by seeing someone's living room or by hearing about their kids going back into sports or just school, or they have an opinion on this, I really do believe it's a time, as long as we can all sort of understand our parameters and understand as communications professionals that we have to be calculated and understand, put up certain guardrails and make sure messaging is aligned. I do think there's a way that people in our companies can be stewards for things outside of their industry of expertise, if that makes sense. Your CFO might never have had a very public persona, but now your CFO could become very relatable when he talks about how, not to use the same example, but yes, he's the CEO of a major organization and runs books and projections and all kinds of crazy things, but he can't remember the times tables he's trying to teach a second grader, and his wife is better at it than he is, for example. It's just these things that I think can make companies and the people at them more relatable. And like I said, if we can make sure that we're using a controlled platform, such as LinkedIn, such as your own company's content calendar, they could work to a benefit. And I think the more we can sort of make these into series, so that if it's virtual learning Wednesday, and every Wednesday your followers or people who want to join your organization, or loyalists to your organization, or groups and categories that look to you for thought leadership, they know that every Wednesday they can expect X company to come out with a viewpoint from one of their employees on the difficulties of having to handle at-home learning, for example. And I think that that's something that can start to fuel a content calendar in a different way as you sort of peel back the curtain into an organization and into the people who make up the organization. Interestingly enough, we were here, and Amelia and Nuri and some of us were talking about this topic matter for, I think, almost the beginning of summer. We started talking about it. And so now we're actually at a time where we've sort of changed again. We remember back social activism is always important and hasn't gone away. But we remember in May into early June, it was especially front and center. And then kind of, never went to a backseat necessarily, but other things popped back up. And now we're at that point again, with things that have gone down in Kenosha and in specific sports leagues and sports teams' responses to that. And I think that's one other point that not necessarily on a slide because it's happened since we've been talking and since we've had to submit our slides here, but we have to always be very cognizant of the news of the day and not being tone deaf, not to come out and talk about something that doesn't make sense in the context of a greater conversation of our industry or of our category. So that if a sports team is coming out yesterday to say, look at us, look what we did a back to school donation of backpacks, something like that. And the rest of the sports industry is talking about shutting down games, that's just something we need to keep our eye on and make sure that our conversation within the greater context makes sense and doesn't hurt us, but is thought out. I certainly feel that openness there is important, and that dialogue internally. Some might have to stay internal, but some could end up being external. But if we all exercise a depth of understanding that can lead to empathy, that's the best way forward there. So sorry, Green Buzz guys, I kind of threw that part in at the end, but I will move on to my last part, which is I always love having a song included. I would sing for you guys, but I don't want you to start drinking too early, and my singing always just leads to happy hour. So this is a tough time, and I quote Lizzo here with "The truth hurts," but we're all suffering in different ways. I just finished talking about social activism, and I think that's one that some are suffering more than others. Some of the guys in the NBA bubble have been very honest about being alone and being depressed as they try to figure out some of these issues and navigate them without their family live and in person. That's something, there's certainly financial stresses, there's human resources stresses, and the things that go on in an organization with its employees. But again, to go back to word I probably already said 2 or 3 times, if we can be empathetic with our own teams and with our consumers, this is sort of the time that I believe everyone will remember as a time when you were here for me, whether you are Jameson, for example, because Jameson whiskey, as soon as New York City bars shut down, and it happened to be St. Patrick's Day, which aligns well with their brand, they came out and started a really big fund, and they were the first ones to do it for bartenders. And bartenders will remember that. Bartenders will remember that Jameson was the one who started first and got other people to join in to be able to help them through the USBG, the United States Bartender Guild. And they will, more so than giving you a t-shirt or a bar mat or a trip to the cenotes of Mexico, you were there for them in their time of need. You thought of them first. And bartenders, in our category are quite important, as they are the gateway to consumers and frequenters of bars take their recommendations quite seriously, as they should. So we believe that, I believe I should say, that was a big move and an important one within spirits, certainly. But it could be big or small. The fruit stand on my corner here in Inwood in northern Manhattan, since basically the start of this pandemic, has had a sign on it that said, if you can't afford fruit today, please don't go hungry. Let us know. We'll give you some fruit, and we're rooting for you. And same with the pet shop. They don't want the animals to go hungry. So I do think, and we've seen a lot of this in communities on social media, Facebook groups, getting in touch with each other and helping each other out. But I do think that if you can foster a community now, it's the time to do it, because it will pay dividends for, I believe, the long term. And with that, I spoke very high level and about sort of competitive brands, but I know Nuri, who's joining from Sodexo, has some great examples of ways that they were able to highlight employee comms and internal comms and work that they've been able to do on the ground and on the virtual ground. So I will pass it over to Nuri.
Thanks so much, Allison. And I think that everyone watching today will see some of your recommendations peppered out throughout some of the examples that I'll show here. And I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to sort of tell our story of how we have navigated 2020. So for those of you who aren't familiar and have never heard the name, Sodexo is basically a B2B facilities management company. So our clients are very large organizations like workplaces, schools, hospitals, senior living communities, venues, And we are hired to manage and maintain their properties, design menus, serve food, and really hundreds of other services. So as you can imagine, for a company based on services, COVID dramatically affected our business at the beginning of this year as the pandemic was moving across the globe. We were hearing from our teams in Asia and Europe about how it was affecting their clients in each industry, particularly in the healthcare sector, and how quickly they were mobilizing. So based on that, we designed an offer to address the pandemic here in North America called Rise with Sodexo. And we launched SodexoRise.com by May 2020. It focuses on operating safely through things like disinfection, cleaning, temperature monitoring, contactless delivery. We have guides and resources to help businesses prepare for these ongoing challenges. But at the same time, our teams were making masks, building temporary morgues for hospitals, finding ways to feed hundreds of school children during shutdowns. And internally, we were receiving a flood of amazing stories. And in many instances, our people are often blended into the background. So this year really helped shine a light on employees who, quite frankly, have been doing this work all along, but now in the context of COVID, we're starting to see more widespread mainstream recognition. So to offer people a more complete view of our Rise with Sodexo offer, we wanted to make sure we told both sides of the story and didn't lose that momentum of recognition. So while people are visiting our site and reading about these very technical services, we wanted visitors to also see the people performing them. That was May. Then we kick off every June by changing our logo, like a lot of companies, supporting Pride and highlighting our LGBTQ community stories throughout the month. And every year we see a significant drop in followers as soon as we switch our logo. The first year we did this, we not only saw a drop, we received tons of angry phone calls and emails. But over time, we've been getting less hate mail and more of our followers are speaking up in support of Pride. For 2020, we released a joint statement between our two internal employee resource groups, Pride and African American Leadership Forum, and we saw one of our biggest downward spikes yet in terms of followers on social. Although our social media team, I have an amazing Maddie and Amanda, just shout out to them because they're absolutely amazing. They were reporting on this, but ultimately it really didn't concern anyone because we didn't do this for the people who were unfollowing. We really did it to foster the LGBTQ community. So when we had an employee this year from one of our competitors come and defend us, it really reassured us that we were on the right track. At the same time, protests are erupting all over the country, and leadership felt compelled to use their platforms to speak up in support of Black Lives Matter. We, as a company, have built a reputation over the years as a leader when it comes to diversity and inclusion in the workplace, but it was clear to our leaders that we still had a lot of work to do. We started by rebuilding our website's diversity and inclusion section to unify their voices. We also changed all of our social media logos and banners to highlight a silent protest organized by our Vice President of HR, Emerson Foster. Black executives from Boston Men's Dinner Group and their families stood in silence at this protest, holding up the names of Black people killed by law enforcement. They intended to show a different image to news media, which is Black people wearing business suits. Emerson, pictured here, was quoted in the Boston Business Journal saying, "A big piece of all of this for us is respect and dignity. Whether or not we're suited and booted, as we say, or we're just walking on the street, we want to know that within our community we can be respected and be respected by the people who are there to supposedly protect us." So if we're going to stay true to our values and take a stand, yes, there's always a risk of backlash. I'm happy to say that the reactions have been overwhelmingly supportive from both inside and outside the company. And, if we're going to call ourselves an inclusive company and a champion of diversity, then we really can't be complacent and we have to continue to work at it every day. And that's really a message really a lesson that we've learned this year, is that it was really a wake-up call for us And so thank you for the opportunity to share how we stay true to our values in 2020. And I hope you found these examples helpful for your brands.
Awesome. Well, I think now would be a great time to transition into an audience-led Q&A. Just a reminder for everybody that there is that Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. It's definitely not too late to throw in any questions that you want to have in the mix if you haven't already. But we did get our first question. This is to Allison from Kelly. If and when sharing employees' personal, authentic stories with customers, do you think the value is in relationship building? So for example, hey, they totally get me and what I'm going through. Or would you aim to add value in an example like, that's a great tip to make my life a little easier, or maybe both? How might you measure success of these kinds of posts? Thanks so much for joining. Sincerely, longtime Orange Stoli fan in Alexandria, Virginia.
Yes, Stoli O. I love Stoli. Stoli O was my favorite. Then we came out with Stoli Cucumber. I'm still an O loyalist, but Cucumber is pretty good. I will let our DMV folks know. Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I think you're right on, right? And I don't want to have a lack of answer, but each case is going to be a little different. I have to say, and I think we're doing as much as we can to plan, but we also have to figure out with news of the day, quote unquote, how to be reactive smartly. And Nuri's example just now with the executives holding up just the names of people in suits. I don't know how much planning, I'm assuming that didn't take much planning, but it felt very authentic that these people had something that they wanted to say and they were able to say it. Going back to the sports league analogy, in the last year or two, well, it's been evident for a while, but especially so in the last 6 months, call it, the NBA has come far and away from being the league that welcomes its players to have personalities, welcomes its players to have opinions, where some other leagues have fallen short. I think they're starting to come around, you hope, but you don't truly know. And I think the NBA is getting the proper recognition for it. When I try to apply that similar thinking to an organization, I'll use Stoli as an example. I would say one of the first things I did when I started at Stoli, and this was years ago, was I interviewed everyone at the company, like one-on-one. And I learned some really interesting things. And this is prior to any of this, certainly COVID or any of that kind of stuff. This was 2015. I remember having a Zoom with a guy who ran the former Commonwealth of Independent States, so all these countries in Eastern Europe. And he was explaining to me that he has to be very careful about how he sells Stoli, because the color red is a very negative connotation in those countries, because red is links to Russia, and they're Eastern European countries who used to be owned by Russia. The next call I had right away, 1 minute later, was with this guy, super fun guy in Greece who ran Greece and a few other countries in that area. And he was just like, hey, Stoli, I love Stoli. Stoli's great. We're the second largest vodka in all of Greece, and we throw parties and we have DJs and all this stuff. And it was just such a different conversation. And I bring that back to those two conversations, because I liked to tell those stories externally to media and explain that this is a global brand and the different ways you need to think about different people and different audiences. And that was never more evident to me than like on my first day. That informed so much of my career with Stoli and with some of the brands we were launching. I just labored on for a bit, but I think what's most important is everything's case by case. I think there are opportunities where we're proactively, saying, hey, listen to our stories. I think you never want to come off as tone deaf or inauthentic. So you don't want to just say, oh, look, this Kenosha, this Jacob Blake and all this happened. And now we just added a chief diversity officer. And now that person's going to go out and say something. I think what Nuri will find with what she did and what Stoli has found with LGBT, we've been in the front lines of LGBT conversations since 1991, and we've had an LGBT ambassador. If you do that stuff and you are out there for a good amount of time, and people aren't seeing that you just popped up a logo and then you did it for a couple months or whatever when the conversation started, but you were a part of the start of the conversation, that will mean more. You can't just shoehorn your way in. But I do think there are ways to plan for it if you can have executives who are willing to get on board, and there are ways to respond and not seem inauthentic. I don't think you want to over pitch it, if that makes sense. I think you want to use your platforms, and then if there's something that's especially interesting or gaining traction, for example, through LinkedIn, you might pull it out and say, man, this might be more interesting than I thought it was. And as a PR professional, you might then start to figure out if that person could become a spokesperson for you, who you actually put in front of media. But I think more and more media and other consumers want to hear from people and not from brands.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, that was a really great way to kind of put it. And piggybacking off of that, I'm curious for maybe some of our audience members who might come from smaller brands than Stoli or Sodexo, do you think now is still a good time for people to start thinking about merging those internal and external communications and showcasing who they have on their teams, or chiming into the conversation from more of a social justice perspective? Or do you think that, if you're a smaller brand, then you should kind of stick to your core?
I think you have to navigate it very carefully. Ben and Jerry's did a really great job back in June, and it was, they're known as a progressive brand, certainly, but they're not. I don't know them to be diverse, though they are progressive. And they came off and did a really, really strong, statement and change and all of that. They had a plan and everything. Where I get a little nervous is, I think as a small brand, you can have a stance, and I think you can come out and support a stance without alienating a base, but you have to be able to back it up. So I don't, if you're a company of 10 people, you have to make sure that what you're saying can be traced back and reflected within your team. So I would just consider some of that. There's a way to take part in conversations. You have to figure out if you should take part in them or if you should be driving them. And I think that's kind of a difference.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I actually think this ties nicely into the next question that I have for Nori, which comes again from Kelly. I mean, when I think about brands and seeing them post things on social about the Black Lives Matter movement or other social justice movements or things happening in the media, they're definitely, I think we all have a great radar as audiences for BS and for is somebody being opportunistic here? Is somebody just kind of cashing in on this, coming a little bit late to the party? It's the safe thing to just, latch onto the bandwagon of whatever's going on at the time. So Nori, how does your team balance authenticity? So it's clear that your company leaders do really care and that your company actually cares about the things that are going on in a way that doesn't feel opportunistic.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I can't help think when you bring up authenticity in this year, we've all seen those commercials where they're like, now more than ever, we're here to help you buy a truck, and really annoy everybody at how tone deaf that is. And honestly, when it comes to company leaders, even though for us, we wanted to make a united stand, we also recognize that our leadership team is very diverse, meaning they all come from very different backgrounds and they all have very different perspectives on what is happening. So for the ones who really weren't as well versed or were just kind of discovering racial injustice for the first time, we encouraged them to be honest about what they didn't know and to approach the subject with humility, as opposed to leaning on the diversity awards that we've won and making it all about how progressive the business is, just taking a step back and recognizing their own position of power and privilege to center that conversation. And also, making it personal. It's a very personal topic. It affects people's personal lives. So, we try to empower them to talk to people from a personal perspective. So as Allison was saying, it works very well more for individual people than for big brands to come up with a statement and add more color to a conversation.
That's great. Yeah. And one thing that I'm wondering, and this is a question for either of you, is just kind of about this concept of innovation and creativity, because right now we're in such a crazy moment where there's so many, on the one things are becoming more informal and people are kind of leaning into that living room, as you were talking about, Allison. But on the other hand, it's a time to be really sensitive. So I'd like to hear from either of you about how your teams are continuing to innovate and stay creative during this time.
Yeah, it's not It's certainly not an easy time, right? I've said for a while, like PR and communications and digital marketing, like we should be three fields that understand working virtually quite well. However, there's so much creativity within our worlds, and I'm one of those people who loves to like write on the walls and like write out our content calendar and have everybody like, and then of course we type it up in some sort of SharePoint or whatever. And it's certainly not easy, but I do think people are finding unique ways, and we are still able to, through sharing screens and things like that, find a way to be creative. It it's also kind of funny, right? Not to flip, but on building a team right now, I have some people. I started a consulting job about a month ago, and I'm working with people. I feel like I've known them for years because of how often we speak and see each other and whatever. But I also know that it's hard to learn people that way, and not in person and not able to get a lunch or whatever. What I will say when it comes to innovations is to Nori's point about, hey, there's a pandemic, but here, buy a truck. I think as long as if we're creating innovations, it should be in a way that is to fill a consumer need. Totally terrible example, unfortunately, but within my industry, is the spiked seltzer game. The spiked seltzer game started to get popular 2 or 3 years ago to start. But it serves a need. People want to go to the beach and they don't want to have to mix up a cocktail. You can't even bring glass to the beach or to a tailgate or to the park. It filled a need, and it actually still does fill a need, because I know people are doing the outdoor meetups in parks and what have you, and those are the easiest things to kind of take with you. So if we're innovating, what purpose are you serving for a consumer with your innovation? I guess that would be the question. And if you could answer that and it's a legitimate way, then I think you should go forward with it.
Yeah, and I think for me, when it comes to these departments that are typically separate, like public relations and marketing and comms, if one thing COVID did for us is really bring us together. I show the example of, putting together a COVID offer in a matter of weeks, just based on what our global teams were doing. So we're talking to our teams in different countries and regions, we're talking to our operations team, we're talking to our marketing team, we're talking to our PR team, how is this story relevant? And we all really had to band together. And I think working remote, I've been working remote, just as a sidebar, for over 10 years. So I'm actually I'm thriving in this situation. But, for a lot of us, it's working remote's also sort of even the playing field. So I'm no longer have to worry about missing side conversations in the hallway. We're all jumping on whatever chat or communications platform you're using to bang things out. And so we've actually been able to mobilize quite quickly in this situation. On the flip side, our work-life balance is pretty terrible, because when you work from home and you're new to it, you tend to lose track of time. And, in the beginning, it's fine because everything's closed, so where are you going to go anyway? But now, as things start to either reopen, or depending on where you are, as things start to open up, maybe your kids are going back to school now and you have to do homeschooling. It's that output of creative content. I just don't know, and I'm answering question with a question, but I just don't know how sustainable it will be for those teams to keep up that volume.
Yeah, I agree with you. I had 2 kind of points to tack on. It is tough, and I found that, again, transparency is sort of key. I don't think everybody could say that whole thing. Oh, make sure you close your computer, don't look at it after this time, or what have you. But people do. Things beep, right? Our Slack is beeping and the emails are buzzing and there's a call and whatever. And it's hard to back away. You want to finish your job and whatever. But what I found is one thing I've tried to harp on is just being transparent. You're taking your kid to Hershey Park, take your kid to Hershey Park. Just tell me you're taking your kid to Hershey Park and nobody will bother you for 2 days, Similarly, it's important to be able to take your dog for a walk or whatever you need to do. You shouldn't, be forced to work 12 or 14 hours just because you're sitting at home. But I will say from a turn, if this is, to your point, a level playing field now, and everyone is struggling in one way or another, some maybe more than others, but everyone is struggling in one way or another with what we're put up against. And so I think if there are stories that employees are willing to tell, whether that becomes an internal conversation or something that's able to be external through LinkedIn or blog posts or what have you, it is worthy to have because it's happening everywhere. It's just a matter of who's talking about it and who isn't.
Absolutely. I mean, another great question here in the Q&A that was posed is, how hard or easy is it for you guys in your respective organizations to get support from leadership to take a stand on any particular topic? What does that process look like? Do you have to wait for leadership to kind of, bring that down to you? Do you have meetings with them and say, hey, we really think that we should choose a side here or take a stand in a position because, it's the right thing to do, and ultimately our audiences and our consumers will, value that we took a stand? Norel, let's start with you.
Yeah, for us, this was actually led by leadership, which is very nice. We didn't have to convince them of anything. I think if you have like a social media team who likes to monitor, trends and test things out in the field, and they'll come back and say, hey, we're actually seeing a dip in followers, we're getting some backlash, maybe we should back off from this. Having that true North Star of these are our brand values, we're not going to stray from them, this is our brand identity, this is actually how we differentiate ourselves from our competitors, we really cannot back down from this. Establishing that early on with leadership made it really easy for us to make decisions when it comes to communicating quickly about things related to race and diversity and inclusion.
Unfortunately, I don't have exactly the same experience currently, although let me give some context. We're in a unique position at Stoli in that these innovation brands we talked about at the top of the call, Cenote Tequila, Se Busca Mezcal, Kentucky Owl Bourbon, among others, are young, new, innovative brands. Stoli is Stolichnia. It's 82 years old now. It has a certain consumer base where, frankly, it's people who put it in their freezer and they've been drinking it since the 70s or 80s. And many of my colleagues and I have been very persistent on needing to be more socially involved because the consumer we're trying to get is socially involved. The consumer who is in their 20s and 30s and 40s wants to hear from brands' stances. The consumer that already loves us, they're in their 60s or 50s, 60s, 70s. Now we need to appeal to the younger base. The conversation that was had for a while too was about Stolichnia is not a Russian brand anymore, actually. I like to liken it to hockey players because it was born in Russia. A lot of great hockey players were born in Russia. It was born in Russia, but it has since emigrated to the biggest offices in New York. Operations are in Latvia. The owner lives in the UK and hasn't been back to Russia in more than 25 years. So it is while the fields there are fields where the wheat comes from are in Russia, nothing else happens there. And I'm of the mindset, as are a few of my colleagues, that the younger consumer would love to know, and I always have to, for legal, I always have to say younger means 25 or LDA plus, but they would love to know that, hey, no, Stoli's from Latvia. We're a European global brand. We're still like, you still get the good Russian wheat, whole wheat, but Russia's not benefiting from this. So that's kind of a struggle that we have truthfully. And it's some leaders have agreed with it. Some leaders have not. Another issue at the company is that the leadership turns over quite a bit. So it has been a bit of a struggle. One thing that we have always been aligned on, though, is our commitment to the LGBTQ community. And that has never wavered, and it has been 365, 12, 24 hours a day. It's not a rainbow we stick on a bottle and take off on July 1st. So, it's a struggle, but we at least have the headway made really, really, really deeply in LGBTQ.
Yeah, and kind of continuing that conversation about consumer needs. I mean, Nori, you and I have talked a bit about balancing what Sodexo's marketing looks like now. At Greenbuzz, we did Faces of Sodexo for you all, and it was so much centered around the human stories and the people behind those stories. And then you look at this COVID moment right now, and being clean and sterile and having each space looking as hygienic as possible is also a new kind of brand appeal. So kicking it over to Nori, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you're balancing these human stories that are maybe more socially driven with also staying up to speed and up to code and promoting your brand that's very, COVID friendly.
Yeah, I mean, and I see a question in the chat about, user generated content. we always have pushed to get user-generated content that highlights these people. I mentioned that when you go to some of our client sites, our people are expected to, or some people just assume that they're blended into the background. These are custodians and cleaners and managers and chefs and sous chefs and cooks, and they're there to provide a service. And so, they sort of blend into a seamless experience for people, and they're made invisible a lot of the time. So, here in this case, one of the things about COVID is it really brought service workers to the forefront. People were recognizing their hard work, and we were able to highlight that, behind this very sterile, polished marketing that you're seeing, they're actually real human beings performing those tasks, making it possible to provide a safe and healthy environment. So it was really important for us, not to move away from that as a service company, as a people-based company, to say, okay, we simultaneously want to show that your spaces are clean and use imagery that conveys that. But also, if you're going to go visit our website and read about sterilization and read about, disinfection, that you also see the people who are actually going to go in and do it. So that's why it was really important for us to, team up with our marketing and do some ad retargeting to make sure that visitors of this site also see the human beings that are actually performing those tasks. And like I mentioned, that's really one of the things that we've always leaned on, is we're a people company. And so it was absolutely important for us not to lose that. I think from a branding perspective, what's changed is visually making sure everyone is wearing a mask, wearing PPE, wearing gloves, social distancing, but otherwise that people-centric messaging hasn't changed.
I have a question for Allison about, when this pandemic started, and I've started to just now see spirits and beer brands, adjust their marketing for the current, and I'm talking mainly about television and broadcast marketing, 30-second spots and things like that. Like, how has the marketing and advertising of the spirits world been impacted, if at all, by this pandemic? I mean, has Stoli thought a lot about making things that are applicable with the times? I just saw a commercial recently where it had said something like, we used to go to stadiums and now your home is your stadium. So this is the right brand of beer for you to be drinking. And, clearly like brands are starting to adopt and, the framework of how people are consuming their products now and where they're consuming them. What are the new approaches that have been brought to the table for you guys in that front?
Yeah, it's a tough time for the industry. I would say, is in a phrase, tip your bartender, please. Something that gets forgotten about, and I mentioned this when I mentioned the Jameson USBG partnership, but bartenders are not, they make whatever minimum type wage. But bartenders and waitresses rely on tips, and they're not getting them if people aren't coming, or they can't even get shifts because places aren't open. At the start of this pandemic, a lot of people, whether they were bartenders or brand ambassadors, spirits who were former bartenders, were doing daily happy hour quarantine type stuff. That was fun and it was good, and brands were trying to figure out ways to engage and reward bartenders who took part in virtual bartending competitions, sort of. And it was good and it was fun, but it was tough. Typically the bartending and spirits community is tough to get with on a phone or through an Instagram message, or on a phone, or through an email. You have to go see them live. You have to go see them live, and that's that's how you reach them. And you never go when they're at their busiest. You go on like a Monday night shift or something like that, or a Tuesday afternoon. But now they have all the time in the world, and I think so do a lot of consumers. We have more time to get people more content than ever before, and most of them are home for the most part. And so what I've seen as a pivot is, to your point, talking about the home experience, the at-home experience. The shift is almost completely to the off-premise, the liquor stores, the grocery stores, where you buy the products and make your own drinks, versus the on-premise. It's unfortunate because restaurants, bars, stadiums, venues, etc., typically make up a large 80% type number of spirit sales. You might have increased your purchases by three bottles of wine a week, but lounges and clubs and stadiums have decreased immensely. So it has been a shift. I think the ones who are engaging, for example, Aviation Gin, any of the brands with celebrity type spokespeople who are engaging, or with brand reps, and whether that means ambassadors or otherwise are engaging, you've got the time. If Ryan Reynolds has the time, then I certainly have the time. And if he's been engaging and doing donations and live chats and stuff like that, the more time you could spend with your consumer in this time and try to educate them a bit on your product or on different ways to use it. That's more using social though. The broadcast stuff, it's tough to figure out what people are watching, right? We always say live sports, and that's kind of the thing, people are watching live. Otherwise you look to Hulu and Netflix and those platforms. But I think the messages have been strong in staying together or being together when you have to be apart. And that's kind of been the thing I've seen the most that makes the most sense.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off that point of being together even when we're apart, and how we've had these digital at-home experiences. This is kind of a question for either of you, but I'm wondering, have you seen an uptick on any particular platform that you hadn't seen before the pandemic, or are there new platforms that you're experimenting with as we're kind of all congregating in different digital spaces at the moment?
If I had to pick one, I'd say Instagram Live. We're doing some stuff with that and seeing some stuff with that and Facebook Live, I guess, a little bit, with people doing bartending and looking for engagement and things like that. Nick Jonas, who's a co-partner of ours, a partner of ours, I should say, with Villa One Tequila, did a couple of those that went well and were a bit different from what he would have done in the past. So people appreciated that.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've seen with a lot of our clients, is that the Instagram live streams are doing really well right now. How about you, Nori? Any new platforms that you all at Sodexo have been experiencing?
Well, it's not as cool as what Allison's been working on. We're a very big B2B company, and so we're going after very large enterprise businesses and organizations. But I will say that this year we have definitely seen a lot of engagement when it comes to our webinar content. So offering free resources, thought leadership, inviting people to webinars, summarizing them, emailing them key takeaways, just positioning ourselves as not only thought leaders, but helpful resource for people through the webinar space has been actually really great for us. One of the things that has come out of that is after the webinar, as you guys know, I don't need to tell you as you're running this webinar, afterwards promoting the recording is sort of an afterthought for us. And it takes a lot for people to go in. It's sort of a heavy lift to come in and listen to a recording where they didn't have an opportunity to ask questions, and they kind of scroll fast forward through and they miss a lot of the really good nuggets in there. So podcasts is also another space that we're really excited to explore. We're working on a proposal internally right now, but those are really the two spaces I'd say, for a B2B, a company like us, that's worked pretty well.
I need to endorse podcasts. Yeah, we've been using those more, just getting conversations out there. I'm not starting our own, which I think is a great idea, but just prioritizing them as interview opportunities, frankly.
Yeah, I think when you guys have, the kind of infrastructure that you do, you can get some really great guests and, have some really insightful interviews with people both in and outside the industry, and connect your audiences and viewers with those people. I think so really, really great resource and a great value add for anybody who's a consumer or partner of yours. I think that's all the time that we have for today's webinar. To everyone who joined us, thank you so much for stopping by. We hope that you had fun and learned a couple things along the way. Just a reminder that everybody will get a copy of today's recording and presentation, and be on the lookout for our next webinar on Thursday, September 10th, featuring Sydney White, the Senior Director of Content and Storytelling at Special Olympics International, and Amy Silverstein-Levner, the VP of Communications and Marketing at Kaboom. It's going to be another great session with lots of great takeaways. So we hope to see you guys there, and check out greenbuzzagency.com/blog again to see the on-demand recordings of any of our previous episodes. Finally, an enormous thank you to Allison and Nori for sharing your time and insights with us. And we can't wait to see you guys next week. Thanks for joining.